Okay, everybody, this is Dr. Sandeep Gupta here from Mold Illness Made Simple, and I'm super excited to have Professor Dale Bredesen on with me today to discuss inhalational Alzheimer's disease and its relationship to CIRS, or what we colloquially call mold illness. How are you today, Professor Bredesen?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me, Sandeep.
Very, very welcome. I'm really excited about this this webinar, and when I was studying a little bit just to present this webinar, it really just astounded me how much of a problem Alzheimer's disease is now, and how exciting it is that you and your research team are coming up with solutions that make this less frightening of a condition for people. So I think during this webinar we should get into some really important clues, particularly for people who are suffering from Alzheimer's, but even those who are worried about the possibility of development in the future.
Yeah, this is a really good point. This is a huge problem, as you probably know. This is a $1 trillion global problem. Alzheimer's disease is now the third leading cause of death in the United States. And as you may have seen from a few months ago from a report from the UK, dementia is now the #1 cause of death in the UK. It has passed heart disease and cancer. So this is a huge and growing problem, and as you know, there hasn't been really anything to do about it. We are in a new era in which complex chronic illnesses like Alzheimer's disease and like mold illness and things like that are increasingly being successfully treated. And so actually, as you know, back in 2014, we reported the first people with Alzheimer's and pre-Alzheimer's who've gotten better. We now have over 1,000 people on the protocol. And actually, I reported this in the book that came out, The End of Alzheimer's, which just came out a few months ago.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm very, very happy that you've got some solutions for people with this condition, and it's not just a slow march towards death as I think it was thought to be a few years back. So let's jump right into this webinar, and obviously we're going to talk a lot about the different nuances of this condition and how it relates to mold illness. So just before we start, I'd like to suggest to people that you may care to close or minimize your other browser windows and have a pen and paper ready, because Professor Bredesen is going to present some very important information during this webinar, which you may not find readily. I also just want to mention that this webinar is for general information only, and it's not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any medical condition. Thank you. Next slide. Most of you who are tuning in today probably already know quite a bit about me, especially if you've been tuning into these webinars, so I'll do this very quickly. But as you would know, I'm a physician from Australia who graduated in 1999 from the University of Queensland. And Professor Bredesen, you probably don't know, but my initial background was in intensive care. And I worked in intensive care for around 5 or 6 years here in the city of Brisbane, until I actually experienced some sickness myself, which was after taking a very strong dose of some antibiotics for Shigella when I was traveling in the United States, and actually developed chronic fatigue myself. And that led me on a sort of a whole journey of discovering solutions for conditions that hadn't been well recognized by conventional medicine, because in terms of conventional medicine, nobody really understood why I should be fatigued and developing terrible headaches just after having some antibiotics for Shigella. And that took me towards trying to understand the microbiome, trying to understand the need for balance within the human body, and balancing the hormonal system and so on. And so after that whole experience, I shifted my whole career into integrative medicine and started a private holistic practice here on the Sunshine Coast, which is called Lotus Holistic Medicine. And I do Skype consults worldwide. And as I was telling you, Dr. Bredesen, I got certified in the Shoemaker Protocol in 2014 due to my partner actually suffering from mold-related problems. And I also did actually experience some symptoms of CIRS myself, and was very lucky to be able to collaborate with many of the other physicians who were part of Dr. Shoemaker's working team, and co-authored a physician's consensus statement with Dr. Zachary, Bernstein, and Rappaport, and McMahon, and Dr. Shoemaker himself. I also created a paper called Surviving Mold Down Under, which is, I believe, is still online at survivingmold.com, for people in Australia who are trying to wrangle with the condition of CIRS. So that's really where I'm at, and I created, and I'll talk a little bit more about the course, but I found that it was extremely complicated and difficult to understand this condition of chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and really wanted to create a format where people could understand the condition and get a bit more hope, and really try and cope with their overwhelm around having been diagnosed with chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which led me to create this course, Mold Illness Made Simple, which I'll talk about towards the end of the webinar. Thank you. Next slide. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your background, Dr. Dale?
Sure. So I've been interested in neurological disease for my whole career. I'm trained as a neurologist and neuroscientist. We've had the lab up and running now. I worked for 2 Nobel laureates, including Stanley Prusiner, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on, of course, discovering prions. And we started actually back in 1989 in my own laboratory studying the underlying cause of neurodegenerative disease. And so the whole idea was, could we understand neurodegenerative disease in a fundamental enough level that we could actually fashion the first effective treatments? And so we've been working on that for 28 years. I was the founding president and CEO of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, and now we currently split our time between Buck Institute and UCLA.
Okay, great. So really, this has been a focus. This Alzheimer and the functional medicine approach for Alzheimer's disease has been a focus of yours for around about 28 years now. You're saying so.
Absolutely.
So
I mentioned the book that we put out in August has been on New York Times bestseller list now for almost 3 months. So there's been a lot of support for this alternative view of the disease, and one that you can actually do prevention. So we recommend anyone over 45 should think about what we call a cognoscopy, basically get evaluated, see where you stand, because the reality is that this Alzheimer's disease should be a rare illness if everybody did appropriate prevention and early reversal.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's no surprise that your book is a New York Times bestseller, because really you're bringing an extremely scientific approach in to this condition, and also offering hope to people with what's otherwise a condition that doesn't have a lot of hope. And so I with this condition being such an escalating problem, to me, it's no surprise that there is a lot of interest in your work.
Thanks. There are over 1,000 people now who are on the protocol, including some people in Australia and New Zealand. And actually, Dr. Dave Jenkins in Australia is seeing some patients there and has come through our course. We've trained over 600 now physicians from 7 different countries and all over the US.
Great. That's wonderful to hear. Great. Next slide. Thanks. Right, so you started talking about this already, Dr. Dale, and a little bit about the global burden of Alzheimer's. And what we've talked about in this slide is that, in the United States, for instance, it's estimated that around 5.3 million people are living with Alzheimer's, and that's just a huge number. But the projections are even more scary. So it looks to me like it's being projected that that number is going to double in the next 20 or 23 years. Is that your view?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is a huge problem. And in fact, when they often say that it's 5.3 million, but what is missing from that is there are many people, of course, who are too young to know that they're going to get it. So the number you really want to know is, out of about 320 million living Americans, how many will get it during their lifetime? And the answer is about 45 million. So in other words, about 15% of the population develops this illness during their lives. It's a huge problem.
Right. So that takes it from being something that's more in the medical minutia to actually being something that almost every person needs to be thinking about. And so, for instance, with myself, with parents who are in their 70s, when I was researching this, I started thinking about, well, what do I need to do to make sure my parents either pick this up early if they start developing Alzheimer's, or at least know whether they're at risk of this condition, because it seems to me that one of the things is the quality of life that people with this condition have is much lower than just the general progression of aging.
Absolutely.
Right. So we'll talk about that later, and talk about some of the tests that you mention in your cognoscopy, which I love that term, by the way. So globally, talking a little bit about Australia, it's considered that around 413,000 people in Australia are living with dementia in general. And in Australia, interestingly, the statistics are more just on dementia in general. There's not a lot of statistics on Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's generally represents around about 70% of dementia cases. Is that correct?
Yes, it's the number one cause of dementia. And as you indicated, there are others like Lewy body dementia and vascular dementia, but Alzheimer's is currently the leading cause of dementia.
Right. And so Robin Williams, for instance, I think was suffering from Lewy body dementia. Right.
That's correct.
And yeah, so in Australia, dementia in general is the second leading cause of death. A few years back, so for instance, when I was in medical school in the 1990s, that definitely wasn't the case. So there's definitely been a shift just over these last 20 years, hasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And this has certainly been on the increase. And there are also things that are now emerging as risk factors. And as an example, if you look at the first responders to the World Trade Center who were in that cloud of dust, they are developing dementia at a higher rate. This is a real concern for others who are involved with toxic exposures. Recent papers showing increases in people who are exposed to smog. So in fact, there are a number of features that are increasing the problem.
Great. Wow. Thank you for that information. So it seems to me that you've put together the pieces on the environmental side of Alzheimer's disease, which up till now have not been well recognized. And as far as the training that I had in medical school, for instance, the emphasis was really on it being a genetic condition, and mainly on apoepsilon E as being a genetic marker. And so if people can see on the bottom right-hand side of this slide, it's mentioned that if you've got a 3-3 genotype, you only have around about a 9% risk of developing Alzheimer, while if you have a 3-4 genotype, so there are two genes, and if you have a 3 and a 4, you have around a 30% risk, and if you have 2-4 haplotypes, you actually have a 50 to 90% risk. Do you still feel this genetic understanding of the condition still holds true, or is it a lot more complicated than that?
Well, there's no question genetics play an important role, and we've really focused on the molecular biology, on the basic underlying mechanisms that seem to be causing the problem. And there is a balance that you have in your laying down of memories and taking them up. I mean, literally, like like you'd look at a contractors, that do construction versus those that do demolition. You have the same sort of thing with what we call synaptoblastic and synaptoclastic signaling. A little bit like people who talk about osteoporosis. You have osteoblastic signaling, and you have osteoclastic, making bone and remodeling bone, basically. We see the same thing. Genetics absolutely have an important role, but what the genetics do really is to change your metabolism. If you have ApoE4, for example, you have a more pro-inflammatory state in general, and inflammation plays an important role in this balance and increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So genetics give you the risk, but they don't determine whether you're going to get it or not. And that has to do with dozens and dozens of things, such as exposures, such as metabolism. As you know, diabetes, type 2 diabetes plays an important role in this. So if you have type 2 diabetes, you have more than doubled your risk for Alzheimer's disease. If you even have insulin resistance, even pre-diabetes, you increase your risk. If you have decreased support from hormones, you increase your risk. If you have specific pathogens like Lyme disease or like HSV1 or P. gingivalis from your mouth, these things all increase the risk and are some of the inducers that actually can lead to this disease. So the key change here is that you don't just name it, Alzheimer's disease, and then walk away. You have to look carefully at what's actually causing the problem.
Great, yeah, thank you for that. So it sounds like we're back to the functional medicine aphorism that genetics load the gun, but your lifestyle pulls the trigger. Would you agree with that kind of aphorism?
That's exactly right.
Great. And so you started talking a little bit about the mechanism, and during medical school, I was taught that beta-amyloid essentially is the cause. It's behind the pathogenesis or the cause of this condition, and generally, you know, it's just something that happens in certain people that are predisposed. However, I've noticed in your work, you've actually described that there can also be a protective response of beta amyloid. Could you talk a little bit more about that, please, Dr. Duck?
Right. So what we found for the many years of research is that, in fact, the amyloid that is produced by your brain is a protective response to three fundamentally different insults. So you are responding to insults. So yes, it's a mediator, but it is not the first responder. So in fact, it is a protective mechanism to, number one, anything that causes chronic inflammation. So the pathogens that we just talked about a minute ago, or things like trans fats, or things like sugar, all of these things can induce a chronic inflammatory state that gives you the production of amyloid and increases your risk. And then the second, we call that type 1 Alzheimer's. Then type 2 Alzheimer's is from a reduction in trophic support, nerve growth factor, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, estradiol, progesterone, pregnenolone, testosterone, free T3. All of these things are providing trophic support for your neuronal network. And especially if you decrease them rapidly, that's when you get this response that involves the amyloid. In fact, showing this amyloid response to trophic loss was done a number of years ago by an Italian group. Calisano and his group showed that withdrawal of nerve growth factor led to the production of amyloid. And then the third thing is it is protecting you from specific toxins like mycotoxins, and so both biotoxins and chemotoxins, mercury, copper, things like that. So for all of these, and of course, Dr. Ashley Bush, who's a prominent researcher in Australia, has spent his career looking at metal binding by amyloid and showing that it's actually quite surprisingly strong. So these things are insults to which you respond by producing amyloid. And it's a little bit like having, you know, the bad guys come across the border. You're basically putting down something to kill them, and then you're scorching the earth. That amyloid is a little bit like napalm. You're killing the intruders, you're scorching the earth, but then you're pulling back, and you literally are pulling back on the size of your neuronal network.
Right. So it's a protective response that's also damaging at the same time. Is that another way of putting it?
Yeah, well, it's a protective response that is associated with a downsizing. That's right.
Great. So if we can help the body to respond in a way where it doesn't need to use such damaging responses, then perhaps the underlying trigger for Alzheimer's can go away. And then that's basically the basis for your work, as far as I understand.
Yes, so the critical piece here is that you must look for all the things that are contributing. And in a typical patient, we find between 10 and 25 contributors. We have not seen a single person yet that only had one contributor to his or her Alzheimer's disease. So you want to look carefully and identify the different contributors, and then you want to address all of those in an optimal way.
Great, thank you. And so looking at these subtypes, they do seem to be quite different in a sense. And so, for instance, with regard to what you call toxic or inhalational Alzheimer's disease, it seems that generally patients are going to be quite a bit younger and won't necessarily have the ApoE4 gene type that we experience with Alzheimer's disease. So that seems to me that it points towards the fact that it's quite a different pathogenesis, or quite a different mechanism for which Alzheimer's is produced in these patients. Would you agree with that idea?
Absolutely. So they still end up with amyloid, and so they are still diagnosed as Alzheimer's, but they're often called atypical Alzheimer's. As you mentioned, they often are young. They typically have either 0 or 1 copy of ApoE4, and they typically don't have the atrophic part for the type 2s, for example, they don't necessarily have a lot of an inflammatory response like the type 1s, but instead they have this chronic exposure to things like mycotoxins or chemotoxins, and they respond by producing amyloid. And the typical person here is a 50 to 52-year-old woman. It's often associated with menopause. No question, this is more common in women, and as Maria Shriver has pointed out, about 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are women. Especially in the type 3, it is more common in women. It seems to be associated with menopause, and the hypothesis is that these toxins are actually sequestered in part in the bones. And as you change your osteoclastic activity, as you are releasing things from the bone, you release things like mercury and mycotoxins. And certainly Dr. Joe Pizzorno has done a lot of work showing that there is a release of mercury at this time. So our suspicion is that this probably occurs with these other toxins as well, because that's the sort of time of life when we typically see this present.
Right, that's very interesting, Dr. Dahl. I actually have never heard that. And that may also correlate with the fact that in functional medicine, we often see patients, or women particularly, who are going through menopause, present with low thyroid function. And I wonder whether there's a correlation with mercury being sequestered into the thyroid to some degree. Would you mind talking a little bit about type 1.5 or glycotoxic Alzheimer's, please, Dr. Dahl?
Absolutely. Yeah, so the glycotoxic, we named it 1.5 simply because it has features of both type 1 and type 2. So what happens when you have too much sugar, as you know, our bodies were really not made to handle large amounts of sugar. And unfortunately, in this day and age, we're exposed to massive amounts. It's really, our bodies are not meant to metabolize this stuff. So one thing that happens, of course, is that you get non-enzymatic glycation. So you get glycation of various proteins. And of course, we measure this as hemoglobin A1C, but of course, many different proteins undergo this glycation. And your body recognizes this and often responds to it with an inflammatory response. This is now an altered protein. So in that sense, you have part of the feature of type 1. On the other hand, you also, in response to this high sugar level, of course, you put out large amounts of insulin. And as you probably know, you don't want to see a fasting insulin greater than about 4.5 or so. And we see people walking all around all the time, 10, 15, 20, even 30, as their fasting insulin is far too high. And so what happens is insulin is a critical trophic factor for the brain. And you actually have a change in your insulin signaling, and this was shown elegantly by Professor Ed Getzel at UCSF, who showed that you get a change in your insulin signaling pathway where you get a change in phosphorylation of IRS1, which is one of the signaling molecules. It literally turns off the sensitivity of your insulin receptor, so that now you have an atrophic situation where the insulin no longer gives you the same response, and in particular, doesn't give you the same response of supporting your neuronal network. So you've got features of type 1, features of type 2, and you've got to fix that, and you've got to restore insulin sensitivity to make these people improve.
Great, thank you very much for that. And so, in all medical training, we tend to have a big list of conditions that are associated with metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, and Alzheimer's disease should certainly feature on those lists, and I think on most of them it currently doesn't.
Oh, well, metabolic syndrome is an absolutely important risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and that's been shown repeatedly.
Great, thank you for this. Okay, I'm going to change gears here a little bit and start talking a little bit about CIRS, or chronic inflammatory response syndrome, before we then go into talking a little bit about the correlation between CIRS and inhalational Alzheimer's disease. And for those who have been following these webinars and the course, none of this will be new info, but for some of you listening, this may be new. So basically, the mechanism which has been described by Dr. Richie Shoemaker and his research group is that biotoxins and inflammagens from various sources, but mainly including water damaged buildings or tick bites or other vector bites, they then lead to a abnormal immune response. And really, I refer to it as being a chaotic and inefficient immune response in certain patients. And it seems that these patients generally have a gene type that leads them to be at risk for developing this chaotic inflammatory response. And this chronic inflammatory response leads to widespread gene dysregulation and also brain changes. And for those who listen to the webinar with Dr. Mary Ackerley, who I believe you know, Dr. Dale, she talked a lot about the different changes that happen in the brain, particularly due to levels of C4A going up and levels of VEGF going down, and also other markers such as TGF-beta and MMP9 also affecting the blood-brain barrier. And generally speaking, in this condition of CIRS, people develop a multi-system, multi-symptom illness, even if they're removed from the original source of the biotoxins, such as the water-damaged building, or even if their infection has been eradicated to some degree. And so this is the overall model of CIRS, where, so Mary Ackerley refers to it as the brain on fire. Well, basically, CIRS is the whole body on fire. Right. Anything you'd like to add to that, Dr. Dale, about just CIRS in general?
Well, as far as CIRS in general, no, I think it's a very important realization that Dr. Shoemaker and Dr. Ackerley and others have come to. I think it tells you a lot and explains a lot about a disease that we really haven't understood.
Absolutely, and so for instance, in my clinic, there was a whole subset of patients who didn't have a very good response to a functional medicine approach and were basically very unwell and dealing with these kind of multi-system, multi-symptom diseases, whether it had been called chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia or whatever. And simply being able to have this framework allowed us to have a treatment plan for these patients where otherwise there may not have been one. So thank you. Yeah. So next slide. Thanks. So before we start talking about the connection between Alzheimer's disease and CIRS, would you like to talk a little bit about what you refer to as a cognoscopy and how basically patients, as they get into their later years, should start thinking about having themselves assessed for whether they would be at risk of Alzheimer's disease?
Absolutely. And certainly people in the past have said that there is nothing that will prevent, reverse, or delay Alzheimer's disease. And of course, that's being shown repeatedly to be incorrect. And for example, the large finger study out of Finland showed the nice prevention with a fairly simple approach. So we recommend that, just as everybody knows that when you turn 50, you're supposed to get a colonoscopy, we recommend that anybody over 45 get a, quote, cognoscopy. And the point there is pretty simple. You want to have some blood tests that tell you whether you have specific markers that tell you that you're at risk. For example, if you have insulin resistance, you want to know it. If you have a high hs-CRP, that is to say in chronic inflammation, you want to know it. If you have specific pathogens like Lyme that you can address before you ever get dementia, you want to know it. If you have a very low thyroid function, for example, you want to know it. If you have exposure to mycotoxins, you want to know that. So you can do this in a pretty straightforward way. Get some blood tests and then take an online cognitive assessment, pretty easy to do. You can do it in about 20 or 30 minutes. And if you're asymptomatic, that's all you really need to do, those two things. You want to know your ApoE4, which you can get from the blood test. You want to know these other markers, and I go through all these in the book. And then if you are beginning to have symptoms, or if you are outright symptomatic, of course you also want to include an MRI with volumetrics. The volumetrics are so important because you want to know, what is my hippocampal volume percentile? How do I change? In fact, is the hippocampal volume low for my age, or is it okay for my age? So it's a relatively straightforward thing to do, and it tells you how you can prevent, or if you've already started down the pathway, how you can actually begin to reverse the problem. It tells you what is actually causing it, or causing the risk.
Right. Yeah. So that's very, very important. And one thing that came to mind while you were saying that, Dr. Dale, is that sometimes we see, for instance, that a female patient suffering from CIRS or suffering from Lyme disease often will have a husband who's also been exposed to the same environmental causes, and we often wonder whether they need to be treated or not, if they're only asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. And I'm wondering here whether in terms of them, the risk of them developing Alzheimer's disease later could be one actual reason that we may consider treating these conditions like Lyme, even if they're minimally symptomatic. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think you would be removing their risk factor, because what we've found, and I've talked to Dr. Shoemaker about this, is that about 2/3 of the people who have this inhalational Alzheimer's, who have this type of Alzheimer's, do not fit CIRS. So they don't have the other problems, but they ultimately end up with the dementia. And they have all the lab values of CIRS. They have a high MMP9 and a high TGF-beta1 and a high C4a. And they typically have an HLA-DRDQ that is associated with hypersensitivity to mold or Lyme or the so-called dreaded multi-susceptible. About 1/3 of them do have typical CIRS. So we think it's very important for people to know, again, early on, because it's so much easier to deal with if you know this early on. I should mention, we are finding that a lot of people who have cognitive decline, who are coming in with the type 3, have multiple exposures. So they'll have, for example, Lyme plus mycotoxins plus mercury. And you need to deal with these to remove the total toxic burden for them to get better.
Right. So this is a really important distinction here between what's classically being called CIRS by Dr. Shoemaker's team and these cases, which actually could be a subtype of Alzheimer's disease. And do you think there's any particular reason that these patients have localized disease in the brain rather than having a whole body syndrome, which is generally the case with CIRS, Dr. Dale?
It's a great question. For some reason, as you mentioned earlier, these people are activating their innate immune systems chronically. And it's important to recognize the amyloid of Alzheimer's disease is really something that is part of the innate immune system. So no big surprise that when you would see someone who's activated their innate immune system chronically with CIRS or with CIRS-related organisms or toxins, that some of these people will have the amyloid and will end up with Alzheimer's disease. Now, why they don't show things peripherally, my guess is there are probably other genetic predeterminants where they actually do well. For example, we had a couple recently where the woman developed Alzheimer's. After the husband came in and we started treating the Alzheimer's, and she's actually improved, he developed CIRS. So they had a moldy home. She ended up having both mycotoxins and Lyme, and has been treated for both of those. The husband ended up with the lung disease, and has done well with treatment for that. So there is, you're absolutely right, there's some difference in people's response. I should add, of course, Dr. Shoemaker pointed out there are people who present with Parkinson's who turn out to have CIRS as well.
Yes, absolutely. And so the other big question that obviously will be of interest to the viewers of this call is, should a general patient with CIRS be concerned about being at greater risk of Alzheimer's than the general population?
It's a great question. There hasn't been an epidemiological study addressing that. Mechanistically, however, certainly they are at increased risk for producing amyloid. So if you want to know, one thing you can certainly do is have an amyloid scan and just see whether there's amyloid there. You can also get the same information from a spinal tap, although I realize most of us don't want to do spinal taps, don't want to be having to get a spinal tap from our physician. But these are the sorts of things you could look at. So yes, I would be concerned, again, anything that's giving you a chronic activation of your innate immune system predisposes you to having Alzheimer's disease.
Great, thank you. And when you say an amyloid scan, do you mean a special type of PET scan? Is that what you're referring to?
This is a PET scan specifically with an amyloid tracer, things like floor beta peer or so-called Pittsburgh compound B. These are amyloid tracers that are used in PET imaging.
Okay, great. And these is that scan generally mainly available from larger imaging centers that are associated with hospitals and so on?
It's available fairly widely, a good point, but yes, it's certainly easier to get at major centers that are doing PET scans.
Okay, great. And so I've also, what's mentioned in this slide is that patients with inhalational Alzheimer's often have the picture of multinuclear atrophy on their neuroquant. And generally we're doing neuroquant imaging or neuroquant analysis on a lot of these patients with CIRS. And so would you say that then a patient who has multinuclear atrophy may be in the subtype that's a little bit more at risk?
And again, there's no epidemiology on this, but it's certainly, you know, again, when you think about are people who have atrophy in their brain more at risk for brain disease? Of course, yes. And certainly what we tend to see is two different subtypes. Either people have more hippocampal atrophy, and as Dr. Shoemaker has pointed out, the hippocampal atrophy can certainly respond to intranasal VIP treatment. Or we see people who don't have the hippocampal atrophy, but have other nuclei and sometimes even more global cerebral atrophy.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And so I'm thinking one practical point which is coming out of this for me is that it probably is quite important for our CIRS patients who get all the way towards the end of the Shoemaker protocol to not only just take VIP until they're feeling better, but also to follow up with neuroquant to make sure that their cerebral atrophy is actually reversed if they want to also reduce their risk of Alzheimer. Would you agree with that kind of approach?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point. You know, obviously you want to reverse that atrophic process as well. And as Dr. Shoemaker also found in his studies, higher doses of VIP were associated with greater reversal of the atrophy. Now, of course, you've got to be worried about the lipase and things like that. You've got to make sure that everything else is okay. But in general, the people who had more VIP, higher dosage of VIP tended to do better.
Yes, absolutely. And we've had a number of people here who have gone up to the 200 microgram per dose 4 times a day, and they have tended to have better responses with regard to their brain atrophy. So thanks for mentioning that. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so changing gears a little bit, we've talked quite a bit here already about inhalational Alzheimer's and some of the different toxins which can cause this condition, which are listed on the left side of the slide here, including water damaged buildings, including heavy metals, and including stealth infections like Lyme disease or Lyme-like illnesses, which is what we're calling them in Australia. Actually, in Australia, Lyme disease is actually not even acknowledged as existing. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. Well,
now, do you evaluate people in Australia for Lyme disease?
Yes, I absolutely do. And so there's a huge disconnect here in Australia regarding what people are actually experiencing and what's being accepted by the medical orthodoxy. And I think part of the problem is simply a semantic one, in that often the people who are suffering from this illness may not have the features that were classic of what was described in Lyme, Connecticut. The original, you know, such as having the erythema migrans rash, or having migratory arthralgia, etc. And often the conditions here are very, very neurological, especially if Bartonella is involved. And so I suspect these patients are a big subgroup that would be at risk of developing this problem that you're mentioning. And so treating the Lyme, do you find that treating if they do have Lyme disease or a Lyme-like illness, is that something that you tend to address first before using, for instance, the Shoemaker protocol, or is it individual?
Yeah, so we do tend to treat early with this. And one thing that's important to point out, we are frequently seeing people who have Lyme co-infections. So you mentioned Bartonella. We see a lot of people with Babesia, a lot of people with Ehrlichia. All these other co-infections seem to be important. And again, another reason that you are defending yourself by making this protective amyloid. So we think that this is an important contributor to Alzheimer's. We see it again and again, and often with the mycotoxins, as I mentioned, and sometimes with metals as well. So multiple contributors.
Excellent. And so with heavy metal toxicity, there seems to be a few different schools of thought on that. And it seems that the most gold standard sort of form of testing is the urinary provocation testing. Is that the sort of testing that you generally recommend?
Yeah, we recommend one of two things. There's a provocation, as you mentioned, and for example, Doctor's Data has a nice test for that. But the other thing that we like is Quicksilver. So Quicksilver has done a nice job. This is Dr. Chris Shade and his group. They've done a nice job in that they will look at urine, hair, and blood. It's not a provocation test, but they are able to tell you then how much of the burden is inorganic versus organic. And of course, the inorganic tends to come from the dental amalgams, and the organic tends to come from the seafood.
Great. And okay, excellent. So the mercury tri-test is something that's also available in Australia, and I think that's quite widely available. And would you say that that mercury is the predominant focus for you, or is there a number of heavy metals that you zone in on?
Yeah, we look at multiple metals, but in general what we found, and this has certainly been published by others, if you look for metals that cause the actual pathology that you see in Alzheimer's disease, mercury has been associated, in animal models, for example, capable of producing both amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So it's certainly a concerning one. Now, it's not a major player in many cases of Alzheimer's, but in a subgroup, it is a key player, and until you address it, the people don't get better. Now, there are others, certainly, and in fact, others have suggested that these contribute and can add to the overall toxic burden: cadmium, arsenic, lead, things like that. And then the other thing we find, especially in type 3, is a high serum copper to serum zinc ratio. And this had been noted before. 30 years ago, there was a paper published noting high copper to zinc ratios in people with dementia. So we look for that as well.
Yes, I think that's really, really important. And that is actually something that myself and Dr. Janet Kim, who's the other Shoemaker certified physician over here, have found very regularly in just CIRS patients in general, that they tend to have an excess of copper and often have a condition called pyroluria. Right, where they tend to excrete too much zinc and vitamin B6. So that's really interesting to see that you're finding it in your Alzheimer's patients as well. And the Shoemaker protocol is something that we've already talked a lot about on previous webinars, so I'm not going to go over that again now. But just to mention that overall, your ReCODE protocol, it's very holistic overall, and it seems to me that you're trying to address all different factors so that people have the best outcomes possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. I came from a very scientific laboratory background, and I had no interest in holistic medicine. In fact, didn't even believe in it before. And so what's interesting is we've come to this. We've come to the same conclusions as the integrated physicians coming through the test tube. So we've simply looked at what's actually driving the underlying molecular biology of the disease. And when you look at that, you really can't refute. It is something that has multiple contributors, and you need to address all of these contributors, or at least as many as possible, to get people over the threshold and to get them to improve. And ultimately, seeing people get better, and we've seen many, many, many now get better, really proves that this is the sort of approach you want to use. And so I have to say, I've really become interested in integrative and holistic medicine simply because it works.
Right, so it's great to see that in your case it wasn't an ideology that you were carrying. It's actually something that's come through scientific inquiry and work with patients, and really, quite clearly you've just been looking for the best approach to benefit your patients and benefit anyone with Alzheimer's disease, and this is what you've come up with. So that's really a delight to see.
I think
sorry, go ahead.
The world of medicine is changing, and we're starting to realize that 100 years ago people were mostly dying of simple acute illnesses, and now people are mostly dying of complex chronic illnesses. And it's really a very different strategy. You have to, you can't just simply give an antibiotic. It's a very different strategy. You have to look at all the things that are contributing. Human beings are extremely complex, and of course, as physicians, we've been dealing with tiny, tiny data sets, things like serum sodium and serum potassium, that really don't tell us why the person is ill. And we need to go much more deeply into these to look at what's causing it and then address the various contributing factors.
Great, thank you very much for that. And so moving on to the role of diet and what you call the Ketoflex 12-3 diet, could you please talk a little bit about what you think that the role of diet is in patients who have inhalational Alzheimer's or maybe at risk of this condition?
Absolutely. And so we initially identified 36 different features, which is why we suggest to people, 36 holes in the roof, you gotta patch the holes if you're going to get better. Giving a drug just patches one hole, it doesn't help that much. And no question, one of those things is diet and nutrition, and it's a very important one. And people have found repeatedly that the approach, there are several pieces that are critical for nutrition. One of them is why we call it Ketoflex 12-3. One of them is to drive people into mild ketosis. And we recommend that people actually get a ketone meter, very inexpensive. You can get a ketone meter and check your own ketones. And you want to be somewhere between 0.5 millimolar and 4 millimolar beta-hydroxybutyrate, one of the ketone bodies. And that actually does help with cerebral function. Ketones support, it's an energy for your brain. You want to get rid of the insulin resistance, get rid of the dependence on glucose, and move to ketone bodies. So you are doing a largely plant-based, ketosis-inducing, largely fat-based diet. And a typical example, we have a woman who's doing extremely well and who's improved dramatically, who is an ApoE44, and they're always told, not to eat too much fat. Well, she has 70% fat in her diet, and her HDL normal, LDL normal, LDL particle number perfect, below 1,000. She's about 850 or so. So this is exactly where you want to be. She's protecting her heart and protecting her brain both, and yet it's a high-fat diet. There's a wonderful website, by the way, that talks about some of this, apoe4.info. I also mentioned it in the book. And what we've done is to go, and what that group has done, is to start using things like MCT oil early on as part of switching from glucose-based to largely a good fat-based. Then, after they achieve repeated insulin sensitivity now, you can go more toward monounsaturates and polyunsaturates, things like extra virgin olive oil, avocados, nuts, seeds, and away from the MCT oil. But in general, many people have noted that people on MCT oil tend to do better with their cognition, and coconut oil is another way to go. In general, the idea of coconut oil is a little longer chain, typically, on average 12 carbons, some shorter species. So-called MCT oil is mostly caprylic acid, which is 8 carbons, a little better absorbed, and many people have noted improvements with MCT oil.
Excellent. Yeah, so one thing I've understood or heard with patients with Alzheimer's who have insulin resistance syndrome is that their brain cells essentially are not able to burn carbohydrates effectively as a fuel, and therefore something like the MCT oil, like you mentioned, is able to be actually utilized by them much more effectively. Is that correct understanding?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what the PET scans show. So if you use fluorodeoxyglucose as a tracer, you see a decrease in glucose utilization in the temporal and parietal region. So basically it looks like 2 L's on the side here, temporal, parietal. And this is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease.
Great. Okay, so that's another really important understanding. Thank you. Okay, and you also mentioned that lifestyle is a very important part of healing from Alzheimer's in general. Would you mind talking a little bit about lifestyle and its role in a treatment program for Alzheimer's?
Absolutely, and I should add before we move on that the fasting. So we recommend fasting 12 to 16 hours between ending dinner and beginning breakfast or brunch, and then 3 hours before bed. That also helps. It also helps to induce autophagy and ketosis. So yeah, you want to have the ketosis, you want to have a plant-based diet, you want to have a largely fat-based diet, you want to stay away, you want to check your gut to make sure that you do not have leaky gut. Stay away from gluten, it pokes holes in many people's guts. And you want to make sure that you don't have high mercury fish and things like that. So this, all this is listed in the book and on the website. And then to go back to lifestyle, absolutely, exercise, sleep, stress, These are huge players in this balance. Remember that there's a tipping point here. So what we want to do is everything possible to move you from the side of the tipping point in which you are literally pulling down. You are decreasing your neuronal network, and we want to shift you to the other side where you are building your neuronal networks. Exercise, as you know, induces brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Ketosis also, by the way, induces brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So both help. That is an anti-Alzheimer's trophic factor, very helpful to have. And then stress, absolutely. High levels of things like cortisol are associated with hippocampal atrophy. Sleep, if you can get 8 hours of sleep at night, or at least 7.5 hours of sleep a night, it's huge. And of course, good sleep hygiene. You don't want to be sleeping in the light. You don't want to be sleeping where there's a lot of EMF, where there's a lot of noise, all these sorts of things, all extremely helpful. And then beyond that, there are a bunch of other things you can do. And I've actually been surprised. If someone had told me 10 years ago meditation was actually helpful for neurodegeneration, I would have laughed. But the data are out. Meditation helps blood pressure, it helps cardiovascular risk, it helps neuroplasticity. So there's no question. And TM in particular, transcendental meditation, has been shown repeatedly, multiple publications, to be associated with improvements in neuroplasticity and stress levels and things like that. Neural agility is something that actually is listed as, quote, meditation on steroids. It essentially drives a specific frequency that enhances memory formation and relaxation. And then, of course, brain training. And Professor Mike Mersnick, of course, just won the Kavli Prize for his work on neuroplasticity. He's the father of this brain training. And again, doing it with the appropriate biochemistry really makes all the difference. And then, as we talked about the exercise, you want to do, at least 4 or 5 times per week. And you want to have both the aerobic side and the weight training side. The weight training helps very much with insulin resistance. So all of these things are helpful in changing this overall balance.
Excellent, great. And it's always really exciting to see the role of lifestyle. And I know Norman Deutsch, who's a psychiatrist from Toronto also, and he came to Australia, talked a lot about lifestyle measures such as meditation, and he was talking about nasal infrared and various other modalities for helping the brain to regenerate. So that's great. So very quickly, just touching on this next area of hormone balancing. Really, this area of hormones is something that also has a huge effect on the brain. Would you like to maybe just make a few brief comments about hormones and Alzheimer's disease?
Absolutely. And so, for example, nice studies out of the Mayo Clinic showing that people who've had an oophorectomy, who've lost their ovaries by the age of 40, if they don't have optimal hormone replacement therapy, they double their risk for Alzheimer's disease. And of course, people who are in the lowest quintile of testosterone increase their risk for Alzheimer's disease. Low thyroid also associated. So all these things are critical. And of course, chronically high cortisol associated with cognitive decline. So it is important to have optimal levels of these hormones. Now, some people find that just doing the right things with diet, exercise, stress, sleep, and things like that, exercise, that actually will help you to improve your hormonal status. On the other hand, other people find that that is not enough for some, and therefore you can use some help with a specific hormone replacement. The bottom line is you want to end up with optimal levels of these various hormones because they do support neuronal structure, they do support synapse formation, and they do have an anti-Alzheimer's effect. And of course, dropping these is really what type 2 Alzheimer's is all about. One of the things that we find, though, for example, is that with the type 3, getting the hormone balanced are very important. So bioidentical hormone replacement, very important for this inhalational Alzheimer's, as is ketosis, by the way.
Okay, great. So the hormones really, I mean, the hormones have a huge role in keeping nerve cells healthy. And so it seems to me that that people who want to prevent Alzheimer's disease should take a look at their hormones and explore the possibility of bioidentical hormones when they start getting into the 50s or 60s. Is that around the age group that you think people should start thinking about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, and even late 40s, anybody, over 45 should be thinking seriously about risk factors for cognitive decline.
Right. And do you feel that it's just as important for males as females?
I do. I have to say, of course, with menopause, there are more drastic changes. And as often pointed out, that andropause is a longer-term process. However, it is important for both males and females.
Excellent, great. And so now jumping onto the metabolic side of things, and so if people, let's say, are coming into their late 40s or 50s and 60s, and they start noticing that they're starting to put on a little bit of abdominal fat and so on, and they want to start improving their health, are these some of the markers they may care to start looking at, and some of the supplements that they might start wanting to look at in terms of just preventing them from going into a full-blown metabolic syndrome?
Absolutely. And as we talked about earlier, metabolic syndrome is one of the most important drivers of Alzheimer's disease. So you want to know where you stand. You want to know your hemoglobin A1C. Your fasting insulin is critical, and fasting glucose is helpful as well. And so restoring, making sure that you have insulin sensitivity, absolutely critical. And then, as you mentioned here, the second thing is methylation. So you want to keep your homocysteine down below 7. You want to make sure that you have enough B12. You don't want to be at the low end of normal, so you don't want to run around with a B12 of 320, 330. You want it to have it above 500. Similarly, you want to make sure that you are optimal for folate and B6 as well. And so all of these are critical. Then the third thing, as you mentioned here, gut, absolutely important. Leaky gut is surprisingly common, and many of us don't know we have it if we don't actually check. This, of course, increases overall inflammation and increases your risk for cognitive decline. So that's also a good thing to know. And people use all sorts of things like slippery elm, or like colostrum, or like bone broth, things like this. As you probably know, one of the issues that's come up with bone broth is you want to make sure that your bone broth hasn't leached heavy metals out of the bones, whatever it was being prepared from. So you have to be very careful about that and make sure it's good bone broth if you're going to use that. But absolutely, you want to have a gut that is healed and working, functioning well. And then, as you mentioned here, things like vitamin D and things like copper-zinc ratio. So these are all things that contribute to this balance, that if it's out of balance for a long time, is what we call Alzheimer's disease ultimately.
Great. So it sounds like that, when you have a good state of overall nutrition, then your ability to defend against toxins of various types is going to be much, much improved. And is that, would you say that's a reasonable general principle for people who are looking to prevent this condition?
Absolutely. To be able to be the most resistant, you want to make sure that you have enough glutathione, for example. So you want to be able to be in a good detox state. You want to be able to make sure that your liver is functioning well. You want to be able to make sure that your mitochondria are functioning well, that your gut is not leaking. These are all things that are protecting you against the development of cognitive decline.
Okay, great. And now moving a little bit more into more specific remedies for inhalational Alzheimer's, would you mind talking a little bit about some of these more specific supplements and in which cases you would utilize these?
Absolutely. And so we utilize these pretty much for everyone who has cognitive decline. So as you say, mitochondrial support, absolutely important. And in fact, a number of people will look at things like organic acids and things like pyruvate and things like that to look at, in fact, at whether mitochondrial function has declined. You mentioned here the CoQ, certainly ubiquinol, and that's what we typically use. PQQ, which increases mitochondrial number. And then, of course, magnesium threonate is something that has been used, was developed at MIT, actually, and has been used by Dr. Guosong Liu and his colleagues for a number of years with good results. And then, yes, vitamin C, and especially the vitamin C, especially for people who have the high copper. So if you've got the high copper-zinc ratio, think more about vitamin C. And again, optimizing these things. Vitamin E, and again, it's not just vitamin E, but mixed tocopherols and tocotrienols. Very important. You want to get your vitamin E up above about 12 or 13. in the lab testing. Glutathione, as you know, not terribly well absorbed, so you either want to have N-acetylcysteine to increase your production of glutathione, or liposomal glutathione, or some people use inhaled glutathione or intravenous. And one of the things we found that the patients who have the inhalational Alzheimer's respond to best is intravenous glutathione. It's often striking. They will improve typically over hours. They will improve for hours, and then the next day they won't be quite as good again. But then when they get the next injection a few days later, they do well once again. And over time, they will essentially ratchet up and begin to improve. So glutathione is absolutely important.
Is there a particular dosage, Dr. Dale, as far as you're aware, for the intravenous?
Yeah, typically what's used is anywhere from 1 to 3 grams.
Okay, great.
This is a couple times a week, intravenous. And again, some people use it other ways. And we like to go back and forth between the N-acetylcysteine when you take the oral route and liposomal glutathione, just because you don't want to get in a state where the person's not able to make their own glutathione. So you want to have the ability in both cases. You mentioned selenium, again, support, and things like cruciferous vegetables, very helpful. And then anti-inflammatories, absolutely. Curcumin is very interesting because not only does it have an anti-inflammatory effect, it also actually binds both to the amyloid and to the tau. So it is very helpful to remove it. And of course, ashwagandha and bacopa and gotu kola have been used for thousands of years by the Ayurvedic physicians with great outcomes. And of course, ashwagandha actually increases the amyloid removal. Bacopa enhances overall the learning and memory. It has an anti-cholinesterase type of effect. And then gotu kola actually enhances focus. So these things all have been helpful and again have been used for many, many years. And then of course you mentioned binders, things like Google and chlorella especially for metals. And then tinospora is interesting because Guducci has been something that actually has helped people. We have one woman, for example, who was being seen at the Mayo Clinic and had been on an antifungal for years, and she ended up finding that in fact the tinospora worked just as well for her chronic fungal rhinosinusitis as the antifungal that she had been using previously. So all of these things are part of the armamentarium for type 3.
Okay, that's excellent. And so a couple of questions about this. Firstly, if someone does seem to have a CIRS-like syndrome and has inhalational Alzheimer's, would you tend to use those kind of natural binders or use cholestyramine as per the Shoemaker protocol?
Yeah, we start with cholestyramine as per the Shoemaker protocol. And now, as you know, some people don't respond to that well and some people do. So I find it extremely helpful for people who are good observers of their own improvement, people who can say, oh yeah, when I started this, it really seemed to help, or their spouses will say, yeah, when she or he started this, it helped, and when they started that, it didn't help. It helps you ultimately to get the optimal program because, as you know, it is different. Some people like to use Wellcol, some people like to use cholestyramine, some people like to use Guducci or Google. So again, metals, if that's a problem, chlorella may be of interest. So it does vary person to person, but we tend to start with cholestyramine.
Okay, great. And so there had been some concern about heavy metals and Ayurvedic preparations. Have you found that there are some brands that are quite reliable with regard to those preparations, such as Guducci and Google?
So, you know, I actually talked to a few experts in this area, and they recommended that they've always had good results with a couple of different suppliers. And I mentioned this in the book as well. So we've basically followed there since they've spent many, many years looking at this. So Banyan, I don't know if you like Banyan, but Banyan's one that's a good supplier. Gaia is another one. And then another one is Metagenics. And then, of course, Natura, Dr. Donnie Yance. So those are all ones that are tried and true.
Okay, great. And then another question regarding curcumin. My understanding is that one of the problems with curcumin is the absorption of it, and that it generally is fairly poorly absorbed. Is there any particular preparations you recommend, or do you tend to recommend liposomal for curcumin?
Yeah, it's a great point. And so I talked to Dr. Sally Frauci. So at least in the US, there was a real resurgence of interest in curcumin, and I realize it's been used for many, many, many years. But there was a real resurgence of interest based on the research of Dr. Greg Cole and Dr. Sally Frauci, who are here at UCLA. And they have looked very carefully at the absorption of this. And what Dr. Fauci pointed out is that if you take it on an empty stomach, that tends to give you much better absorption. Or alternatively, if you take it with fats, and of course people use the bioperin as one way to do that. So any way you want to do that gives it a fat base is another way to get it absorbed. And either one of those is fine.
Okay, great, thank you for that. And just regarding resveratrol, which we didn't cover much, do you feel that its effect on the sirtuin genes is an important way in which it may help protect from Alzheimer's? And do you feel the sirtuin proteins have a role in this condition?
Absolutely, and I was really convinced of that through the research. I was actually surprised to see how striking that is. So SIRT1, for example, does increase the alpha secretase and drive the APP into the anti-Alzheimer's signaling. And of course, SIRT1 has an auto-inhibitory role. So it actually is, it turns itself off. And then of course, when you are low on nutrients, the NAD, which is now the oxidized NAD, will actually now remove that auto-inhibition. And so resveratrol does the same sort of thing. And of course, nicotinamide riboside is another way to go. But yes, you are removing the auto-inhibition of the SIRT1, and that does change the signaling and give you more, for example, SAPP alpha. So you are more on the signaling that you want for supporting synapse formation. I think this is an important area for looking at what's actually driving the Alzheimer's process. And one of the things we found, for example, and published was that ApoE4 binds to the promoter region of SIRT1. And so if you look in the brains of patients who are ApoE4 and have Alzheimer's, they have marked decrease in SIRT1.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for all that. This is your book, The End of Alzheimer's Disease. Would you like to just talk to us a little bit about which people may find this book most beneficial, and what information are people likely to get out of this book that would benefit them?
Right. So the book is specifically written to be read by everybody. So for caregivers, for people with Alzheimer's, for people who are not necessarily scientists or physicians, but are concerned about their own potential for cognitive decline. So it's also, we've got a couple of chapters that are specifically for scientists, and so you can skip those or read them, and I mentioned that in there. And then we go through all the tests that are helpful, and then all of the approaches to those tests. So my hope is that physicians who are caring for people who are either at risk for cognitive decline or have cognitive decline will take a look at it. And we have specific tables also, so that people can look at what tests are optimal, what values of the tests are optimal, and then what to do about each thing. We also have things going through specific, nutrition plans. What are the specific requirements for nutrition, etc. So basically, it is a book for everyone. The goal is to help to reduce the global burden of dementia.
Great, thank you. And I'm very, very happy to hear that it's become a bestseller, and hopefully that this information that you're putting out there on Alzheimer's disease is going to be, hopefully, become mainstream and even part of medical training. And are you aware if any medical schools have embraced some of your ideas as yet?
So it's interesting, the first medical school to embrace any sort of functional medicine here in the States has been Cleveland Clinic. And so Cleveland Clinic in the last couple of years has set up a functional medicine center, and Dr. Mark Hyman is the director of the Functional Medicine Center, and Dr. Patrick Hanaway is the co-director. And actually we're working with them and with Dr. Nate Bergman, specifically on the Alzheimer's part. So there's interest there, but you're absolutely right. The centers around the country are still using the old-fashioned approach of giving Aricept and not looking at these various contributors to Alzheimer's disease yet. And I hope that over time that will change.
Great. Yeah, I really hope that starts becoming a part of the mainstream. I'm just going to talk very briefly about my course, if that's okay, Dr. Dale. A lot of people who have been coming to these webinars will already have heard me talking about it quite a bit. But basically, it's called Mold Illness Made Simple. The motivation for me creating this course is, for me to learn this illness, I had to read a number of 100-page documents that were super technical, and just finding that people were feeling very overwhelmed who were suffering from this illness. And I wanted them to feel more confidence around understanding the illness and understanding the alphabet soup that comes around things like C4A and TGF-beta1 and MMP9, and to really get some hope around recovery, because it really is possible to recover from this condition. But a lot of people seem to get into overwhelm, and when you're in overwhelm, you tend not to move forward. So really this course is designed to help people with this illness to move forward. What's included is 18 video lectures and slides. There's a weekly quiz, and there's a workbook for each chapter, like you can see on the right side of this the screen. And so you can see what's mentioned, what's discussed is going through all of the different aspects of CIRS one by one and breaking them down. So it seems that a lot of people, and especially in CIRS, what seems to happen is the caudate nucleus seems to get affected. And according to Dr. Shoemaker, this may actually affect people's ability to assimilate information. And therefore, it kind of becomes a double whammy with them having this illness, which is so complicated to start with, and also possibly having a impairment to learning. So that's why I tried to make this as simple as possible. We also have a private Facebook group for people who have got up to chapter 5 that they can ask questions. And the feedback so far is that the course has helped people to definitely regain a lot of hope and to deal with their overwhelm and just feel like they had some understanding of what was really going on with this illness and what they need to recover. So hopefully it is achieving its purpose. It does take a bit of work. It's not for people who just want to get an instant kind of fix. It's going to take, you need to invest at least 1 or 2 hours every week for around about 8 weeks to get this information. So you have to be willing to at least invest that amount of work. But if you do invest that work, we pretty much guarantee that you will come out of this feeling that you understand this illness. So we have done another little discount code after this webinar, which we've called BEAT-AD, standing for Alzheimer's disease. And I do also want to mention that people who may only have mild symptoms and think they may have a mild form of CIRS, it may be worthwhile for them to think about taking this course as well, in terms of just simply preventing Alzheimer's disease, as Dr. Dale has talked about on this webinar. So on the YouTube video that'll come out after this, the actual link to sign up for the course with this coupon code will come up. So thanks very much. We can move on. Okay, great. So if it's okay, Dr. Dale, I've just got a few questions and answers. I know we're getting up to our time limit here, but is that okay with you if we just ask a few quick questions of you? So the first question is, when the ReCODE protocol is implemented and at the appropriate time of treatment, are there therapies that are particularly helpful for removal of beta-amyloid?
Yeah, so again, here's the trick. You don't want to remove the amyloid before you remove what it's protecting you from. So if you have ongoing chronic exposure to things like mycotoxins, the last thing you want to do is start to try to remove the amyloid. And we've actually had a number of people who have had amyloid removed with antibodies who've gotten worse when it was removed. So first you might want to identify what's actually causing it. When you have addressed those things, when you're making sure that there's no more exposure, then yes, there are a couple of ways to do that. And of course, curcumin is one of the ways that's been looked at. And low doses of curcumin, 1 to 2 grams total, are good for anti-inflammatory and some removal of amyloid. Higher doses, people use 3, 5, even 10 grams. This binds to amyloid and tends to help remove it. Ashwagandha is another one that actually increases the metabolism, ultimately the removal of this. Again, just getting your insulin down, because insulin degrading enzyme degrades amyloid. So your insulin degrading enzyme is competing between degrading your amyloid and degrading your insulin. So getting your insulin down, helpful to allow your IDE to be one. And then of course there are several enzymes, neprilysin, ECE, things like that. So that's another way to go. And then, of course, there are trials ongoing with various antibodies to remove amyloid. But again, I would caution people, make sure you remove the reason for having the amyloid before you remove the amyloid itself. Once you're doing that, though, there are lots of things that can contribute.
Great, thank you. That's a really, really important point that you bring up there. The next question is, in patients who have CIRS or inhalational Alzheimer's, who have significant cerebral atrophy, what approach do you suggest they take if after 6 months or a year of intranasal VIP and having done the rest of the steps of the Shoemaker protocol, they're still not finding that their cerebral atrophy is improving?
Yeah, so I think the first thing we find is that if people are not getting improvement, there is something else that hasn't been identified. So you want to find out. One of the common things is, for example, we had one woman who did well, but it wasn't back to perfect yet. And so we said, we're missing something. She ended up having babesia that had been undiagnosed for 10 years. So she had had a tick bite 10 years before. She had been treated for her Lyme, but she had never been treated for babesia. She's now being treated for babesia, and she's doing better. So the first thing is to look for other things that may be contributors that may have been missed. The second thing is compliance. Frequently, we find that people are not complying with things, and we recognize it's not easy to do all these things. The third thing is, are you achieving optimal levels of these various things? Again, you don't want to be at the low end. So we want to make sure that your B12 is over 500. We want to make sure that your homocysteine has come down. We want to make sure that the various things are all critical. Is your gut still leaky? Is your rhinocynal microbiome? This is turning out to be an important area. Some people actually have found, as you know, that actually using kimchi juice is part of optimizing your microbiome, your rhinocynal microbiome. I think there's going to be more and more interest in the nasal and sinus microbiome because this has such access ultimately to your central nervous system. So it's tweaking these things. If you've looked at all of these things and you're still not getting improvement, then ultimately the question is whether you should be involved in one of the stem cell trials. And as you know, there are now more and more stem cell trials specifically. Again, we would recommend don't do it as by itself as a monotherapy, but combining all the things that actually support your neural growth.
Great, thank you very much. I totally agree with your response, and I've definitely found that often these patients who are not improving with VIP do have some kind of stealth infection going on in the background. Do you ever use any of the herbal nasal sprays which have been recently developed, such as RG3 or Synapsin, and do you feel they have a role in helping with these kind of conditions?
They may absolutely have a role. We have not been using those so far, but I'm very interested in intranasal approaches. Intranasal nerve growth factor, intranasal ADNP. Of course, there's a trial with intranasal insulin. I'm a little worried about that one because now we're trying to make you insulin sensitive and you're flooding the field with insulin. So that worries me. But yes, I think, again, because of the access, the intranasal approach with various trophic supports are going to be huge. And of course, we treat MARCoNS. Yes. And so that's obviously part of the CIRS treatment. So no question, the nasal route is absolutely critical.
Great, thank you. And you often suggest that being ApoE4 may actually be protective against type 3 Alzheimer's. However, if a patient does have an ApoE4 genotype and also elevated levels or abnormal levels of many of the CIRS markers, does that require any adaptation to the ReCODE protocol?
So that's a really good point. We had mentioned this a few years ago that we see that in general, the people who tend to get the type 3, the IAD, tended to be more with the ApoE4 negatives, unlike type 1 and type 2. And it's interesting because this is the same sort of finding now that others have seen with the Chimane Indians, who, of course, when they have parasites, they do better if they're ApoE4 positive. Similar story with Dr. Tuck Finch's work in Ghana. These people die relatively young, the tribe that he studies, from infectious illnesses. And guess what? If you've got ApoE4, you do better. You tend to live longer in that group. So neither one is necessarily advantage, disadvantage. It's different. You have a more pro-inflammatory state if you are ApoE4 positive. And you tend to have some resistance to these sorts of things like molds and mycotoxins. However, as you said, some people, and we have a number of people who are ApoE4 positive who do have type 3. And we don't, for them, what we do that is different is, yes, you have a longer fasting period. You go, instead of 12 to 14, you go 14 to 16 hours. We want to be more on the anti-inflammatory side. But otherwise, the main branch point in ReCODE is whether there is evidence of type 3, in which case you've got to have that protocol included. The good news, if you have no evidence of type 3, hallelujah, just with your, getting your insulin sensitivity, optimizing your hormones and things like your nutrients, you're going to do very well likely. So that is the big branch point. You want to know if there are CIRS labs for these people.
Great. Okay, thanks. That's a very, very important point. And then the final question, and there's two different questions which are sort of related. There's a lot of disagreement regarding the best way to measure metals such as copper and zinc. And so that includes serum, red blood cell, and hair. And one person is saying that testing metals through Quicksilver and LabCorp result in dramatically different values. Could you talk about a little bit about what exact type of testing you recommend for the zinc, copper, and other metals, including heavy metals?
Yeah, this is a controversial area. Actually, I just got an email today from Dr. Fredrickson, who is doing these sorts of things, looking at zinc in hair and nails, and he argues that that's a better way to do it. No question, it's helpful for things like red blood cell magnesium, a much better way to look at magnesium than just standard serum magnesium. Red blood cell zinc, a good way to look at zinc as well. Having said that, we also like to look at serum copper to serum zinc ratio. You mentioned the KPU earlier, and that is something that you see repeatedly. And so we like to see that copper-zinc ratio in the serum, in addition to having whether you like RBC zinc or whether you like to do it from hair and nails, whatever. Absolutely, it's a very good point. And again, 6-hour urines, for things like heavy metals, when you're trying to look at these things that are actually in the various organs. So this is an area where you actually get complementary information from doing this in different ways.
Great. Thank you very much for that clarification. And on that point, I think we're going to wrap up the webinar. I want to give a big thank you to Professor Dale Bredesen for coming along and for all of his groundbreaking research on this area of Alzheimer's disease. As I've already said, I think your work is really a ray of light of hope for the many millions of people who are suffering from this condition or at risk of this condition. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and we hope to include you in future in our revised version of our course, your work. And also a big thank you to Caleb Rudd for his technical support and content support. So everyone, I hope you've really benefited from this webinar and you've really got a bit of insight into how inhalational Alzheimer's relates to CIRS and which people should be thinking about Alzheimer's disease as being a possible risk for them and what things they can do to prevent it. So I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and we'll see you in our next webinar.
Thanks, Dr. Sandeep.